All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to get started and begin first by giving a bit of context for this lecture that Joe came to NYU to deliver as a guest of Glucksman Ireland House and of the Modern and Contemporary Colloquium of the English Department. We had a desire to mark the centenary of Ulysses from the moment it appeared on the horizon 4 or 5 years ago. And of course, the pandemic upended the best plans and even nascent plans. So not knowing what we could do, and with the university prohibiting any in-person visitors, we just tried to hang on. And then we got quite lucky in that Joe Valente, who had been always our first choice to invite to NYU to do something to mark the centenary of Ulysses. Joe had agreed to do a lecture, and then luckily he was the first person to come to NYU once the visiting policy was relaxed. And Joe came in March, on March 13th, and he delivered the lecture that we have presented to you via the YouTube channel, and to a excellent audience. Many of my undergraduate and graduate students were there. We had a delightful conversation following that. And unfortunately, though, the recording that was set up in 2 different ways failed us. And so we got 25 or so minutes of good recording of Joe delivering the lecture. But then the camera shut down, and then the fisheye camera in the ceiling, it turned out, wasn't working, and the Zoom session wasn't recorded. So it was a triple failure. And I guess that goes on with us getting back into the swing of things again. But then Joe came to the rescue and very graciously helped us out by recording a version of himself reading the lecture. And that's what you get in the last 32 or so minutes of what's up on YouTube. So we are delighted that you've joined us here today. I have a number of graduate students and colleagues and from around the Joyce world and the Irish Studies world who are here in the room with us today. What I plan on doing first, I wanted to begin by thanking Joe Valente for being a mensch and delivering, as we always expect he would, a truly brilliant and very timely lecture, and one that was written in very trying circumstances. And Joe lost his mother in the fall, and we appreciate the fact that he rallied despite the personal loss to produce a new and quite remarkable address to the question of the currency that Ulysses has managed not merely to accrue, but to continually accrue with new generations of readers and in new circumstances. And that's really about the first 18 or so minutes of the lecture is devoted to trying to think about this remarkable.
On the road.
Sorry, can I ask who's? Okay, so there we go. The remarkable capacity of Ulysses to renew itself with new generations of readers, and to become, as Joe says, ever timely rather than timeless as a work of art, which I think is quite a remarkable feature of the text, and one which now we have, I think, in Joe's remarkable reading and in his extraordinarily subtle way of connecting the question of what he calls the sort of structural latency of the text with its connection to our current moment and to the Me Too moment. And that's where I'd really like to sort of direct our discussion after we hear from Joe and after I kind of retreat for a little bit. And that's really the sort of bulk of the reading of Cersei that Joe offers in the latter 2/3 to a half of the lecture, and which I think will provide a kind of very interesting point of conversation for us. So, by way of introducing Joe, there are 2 introductions in the lecture itself, one from myself and one from my dear colleague, Richard Aldersley, PhD candidate in English at NYU. What I do always like to do, though, is just to show the volumes themselves. Joe knows I'm a fan, and most people here know I'm a fan of Joe's work because I teach I don't teach Joyce without Joe Valente helping me get clarity and force and energy in the text. But I'm also really delighted that I can just show the books themselves. This is Joe's first monograph. This is an extraordinarily important book. It's 26 years old now. James Joyce and the Problem of Justice, Negotiating Sexual and Colonial Difference from Cambridge. And I think as we get to talk about the question of justice in Ulysses, and particularly in relationship to Cersei and to the Trials of Leopold Bloom, I wanted to begin by remarking on the fact that, as Joe says in his lecture, everything that he does as a critic is concerned ultimately with the question of justice. But this question of sexual difference was also crucial to another work that I've been using quite a bit in my teaching, which is Joe's edited collection from 2002, Queer Joyce. And this is only the surface of the work that Joe has done as a Joyce scholar, as I'm sure all of you are fully aware before now. But I wanted to begin by sort of showing the book. So Joe, welcome to the room. Before I get into a few specific topics that I'd like to bring out from the lecture, I wondered if you wanted to begin by saying anything in terms of the framing of what you were trying to do in the lecture itself, and in the way in which you open up the stunning reading that you give of the trial of Bloom and Cersei.
Okay, I think if I was going to put a frame that that's slightly different than, but certainly cognate with the frame that I did in the lecture, I would probably begin with this question of justice understood from a Derridian perspective, that is, as something which is always aspirational, never achievable, and always a problem. Right. That's why the title of the first book is The Problem of Justice, that it is always a problem. And that the way in which I think Joyce frames the Trials of Leopold Bloom, and more generally the sexual ethics in Ulysses, is precisely involves the idea of judgment as something that involves what I call both a stay and a leap. A stay insofar as it is always practically necessary but logically problematic to stop the consideration of all of the factors that define a given situation and the actions taken in that situation. At a certain point, you have to stop. And what Ulysses does is provide an almost interminable set of factors that you can bring to bear on an ethical judgment. At a certain point, you have to stop. That's your stay. And it's also, on the other hand, it's necessary practically, but again, problematic that you have to, having stopped, you have to make a leap, which is a leap to some kind of resolution or verdict, right? And so the interesting question for me around the sexual ethics of Ulysses, I mean, one of the interesting questions is precisely the challenge that Joyce offers in Ulysses to our capacity to render verdicts, and the way in which we are always continually in this, what Derrida calls moment of suspense. A moment of suspense that's not the same thing as a suspended judgment, right, or a suspended sentence, because you ultimately have to come to sentence. But it's a moment of suspense in the sense that there is a hiatus, a gap between any series of codes of value, of rightness, and the judgment that proceeds from those codes. The factors, the contextual factors that work defining the code, allowing the code to operate, also at a certain point mark a limit to that code. And so an ethical judgment finally can't be rendered simply by reading off of a script. That provides an interesting problem with respect to sexual ethics, because of course, all of the sexual activity, the fantasies, the practices, they all involve social scripts, and people are playing out social scripts. But the ethical judgment can't simply rely on a script, right? It involves necessarily some kind of move beyond the script, which also means that the doing of justice always involves the risk of doing injustice, right? And that you can't do justice without incurring that risk of doing injustice, okay? And for me, what was bottomlessly fascinating, if you will, about the sexual problem that I focus on in the lecture is that masochism is precisely what Suzanne Stewart calls a disturbance of morality, insofar as it requires transgression in order to achieve the punishment that underwrites the morality, right? And so this idea of, instead of having what Dostoevsky might call crime and punishment, a kind of logical move from offense to consequence, masochism involves, at a certain point, the desire for the consequence, which incentivizes the crime, right? So that's a disturbance of morality and sexual morality that is really interesting in terms of Bloom's fantasies, and it's really interesting as a particular crystallization of the problematics of justice.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. What if in doing justice by exacting punishment for sexual offense, you're giving the offender what he wants? Yeah.
So, and if I could follow that up with a crucial observation you make, which is that in Circe, that you stage a confusion between memory and fantasy, right?
Well, I don't stage it.
Or no, Joyce does. Or you read
Joyce, and there, it's really important, it seems to me. And this is a point I want to make about that confusion, because I just think that it's there's a long critical history involved in trying to establish what is the relationship between the Circe episode and the rest of the novel. You don't have long critical traditions worrying what's the relation of Nestor to the rest of the novel, or the Laestrygonians to the rest of it. Circe, what's the relationship of Circe to the rest of the novel? And people whom I revere, like Hugh Kenner, like Nabokov, have weighed in on this. And yet I think that, from my perspective, they haven't gone far enough, because they almost all of the critical tradition involves the way in which Circe rewrites what has come before it, or rearranges what has come before it. But what they don't seem to get at is that what Circe is doing is unfolding what was already there in what came before it, right? That Circe is created by the subliminal fantasies that underwrite the reality of stream of consciousness, right? And what Circe does is it turns it inside out, right? And so there's a reciprocal relationship between Circe and what has come before. It's not simply Circe reworking what's come before, it's what's come before actually contouring Circe subliminally, right? And Circe bringing out its own conditions of existence, its own psychosexual conditions of existence, and staging.
Can I ask you to sort of follow that line of thinking with an attention to something that's also quite brilliantly stated in the lecture, which has to do with the question of antic performance in the afterlife of Ulysses, and the sort of pleasure that Ulysses has generated, generationally speaking, over time, in its performative possibilities, right? And I'm just wondering if you could say something, Joe, about drama, Joyce's relationship to dramatic performance, right? And the why Cersei is so important to think through in precisely in this question of the relationship between performance and fantasy, right? Because I think there's a wider principle of dramatic intelligence at work in Ulysses that makes its performativity come out, but which in fact also I think Cersei in some senses theorizes or interrogates for the rest of the book, right? Which, if I'm following you correctly, I think that connection is worth making.
I think that one way of thinking about this, Stephen Dedalus in A Portrait of the Artist says, what does the artist do? He transmutes the bread of daily existence into. And I think what stream of consciousness does is transmute the subliminal fantasy into the performance that we call everyday reality, right? And what Cersei does is illuminate the fact that that's what's happening, right? That what's happening is not just reality. What's happening is the conversion of what Lacan calls the real into reality, a conversion of fantasy into performance, right? And what Cersei does is performs that conversion back again, right? Performs that conversion back again. And that's where it seems to me that the question of drama becomes really important, because drama is precisely that venue where we can see the extent to which drama was there all along.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the drama is the what Shklovsky calls the bearing of the device. Right. It bears the performativity of the everyday. Right. And Joyce does that in such a radical way, precisely by digging so deep into the psychosexual real that is getting converted into the performance.
Which is, of course, why we have a trial about sexual fantasies, a trial, right. a trial stage, a staged juridical proceeding in which the question is identifying the subject matter of a fantasy, right?
But the point that you started with seems to me to be crucial and unexamined, which is the extent to which our collective psychosexual unconscious is at stake in our enjoyment of Ulysses, right? I mean, our enjoyment of Ulysses, I think we tend to think of our enjoyment of Ulysses as, cognitive and as aesthetic, but as in all, in some ways, an answering of the hyper-consciousness of the aesthetic method in Ulysses by the hyper-consciousness of our critical method, right? Which is all well and good, but hyper-consciousness only comes about through a conversion of unconscious fantasy. And the extent to which Ulysses has been able to tap, and as you say, renew itself by tapping unconscious fantasy, seems to me to be something, and our unconscious fantasy seems to me to be something that we don't think about that much.
I'm really, really persuaded by that. But just been thinking about Bloomsday, and next week Bloomsday, the sort of what you call, I think that the sportive, antic and sportive.
Sportively, it's arcane. It's arcane and yet sportive, right? It's sportively demonic, I think was my
exactly.
phrase. And I say that because I labored over that phrase quite a bit.
But also, Joe, let me come back to something else though, to connect to what you were saying about drama, because I'm feeling the thread of something really kind of illuminating being woven there, and I'm trying to think here also about ritual, right? And the relationship that Joyce has such a deep and complicated relationship to ritual, right? And the book Ulysses obviously begins with the ritual of Catholic identity, of the Mass, and of the notion of inversion and performance, of playing, right? So I think we're tuned in a way from the very first page of the text to think about the idea that performance and ritual and drama are and real life have these these sliding boundaries that are not clearly marked, but they're also not necessarily boundaries so much as conduits for the latent energy of psychic life, right? Which in a way, thinking about drama and about ritual, there's also something.
What I'm thinking about now, just so you know, what you got me thinking about now is religion.
Yeah.
And
that's where I wanted
to be honest with you, you don't have to push very far.
Well, Bloomsday itself has a ritual.
Yeah, but I think that there's there's something if we want to talk about how remarkable, what an explosion Joyce's Ulysses was in the history of the novel, in the history specifically of the English-speaking novel, then we might want to think about the religious context out of which Ulysses came and out of which the novel came, because the novel has always been kind of a Protestant thing, right? The English-speaking novel has been a Protestant thing, right? And the Protestant tradition is not really that heavily invested in ritual, right? And so it is, in fact, one of the yields, it seems to me, of Joyce's intensively Catholic background. And I say this as someone whose background is probably just about as intensively Catholic as Joyce's.
We've talked about this, yes.
Yeah, I mean, just and suffered much the same way as Joyce did. But the intensively Catholic background, which is, someone, I was asked to do a kind of a biographical lecture at Penn, in which I would just hold forth on, what were the kind of factors that went into my criticism or my becoming a literary scholar. And I thought about it, and I knew what they wanted, because Queer Joyce had just come out, and I knew they wanted stuff about my sexuality, really is what they wanted stuff about, which, is not something I was really inclined to give them anyway. So what I gave them was my Catholic background, and my Catholic background in this sense, that Catholicism is a universe. It's a universe. It is institutional and ritualistic in such a way that, unlike many other religions, it produces itself as an enclosed whole, right? You never have to leave the universe of Catholicism. It will give you, everything you need,
The exit fee is high.
Right. And the exit fee is high, right? It'll give you everything you need and nothing you want, but it'll give you everything you need, right? And part of that idea of it being, and you can see this in A Portrait of the Artist, the extent to which it is Stephen's universe, right? And when he leaves it, it's not just guilt, it's not just shame, it's fundamental disorientation. He's walking down the streets of Cork trying to repeat his freaking name, because having already taken that step outside, it's like, where am I, right? And so I think that the extent to which you have a universe constructed out of carefully deliberated, lovingly burnished rituals, right? Not just the Mass, but all of the other 40 hours devotion. I mean, it's just, you just go on and on, right? That gave Joyce, I think, a particular insight into what you call the sliding nature of ritualistic performance and everyday practice, and the way in which they are deeply entangled with one another and, in some sense, inseparable from one another. And that Ulysses could stage that, and stage it so dramatically, right? I think has a lot to do with that context, right? In which it was already, closer to the surface, perhaps, than in other ideological and religious traditions.
Yeah, that's a fascinating That's a fascinating way of putting that. And thinking again specifically about ritual. I mean, so the other your comments about Protestantism in the novel, I mean, they resonate with me, but I also, romance as a generic form that Joyce, from Araby on, Joyce really associates romance with a particular kind of Catholic formative, development, right? And the relationship between ritual and romance, right? Not just to quote the Jesse Weston, but to think through the idea that ritual has a promise through performance that's romantic in a certain sense, right? That leads.
Flip it the other way. One way of thinking about the way in which sexual attraction, which may be an operation of pheromones for all I know, is converted into something like romance, is through ritual.
Is through ritual, yeah.
Right. This is why I teach Araby on Valentine's Day. Right. So because Valentine's Day is sort of the day devoted to the ritualization of romance. Right. And you're right. I think Joyce always understands that romance has this highly ritualistic quality, right?
If we can, well, let me think of where we want to sort of take this, because there's a lot of, still worth kind of bringing out, and you're welcome to jump into the chat, and we'll hold things in the chat for a little while until a few things accumulate. But if anybody wants to pose any questions to Joe, take the moment to do so in the chat. There was something very interesting in the lecture, Joe, where you adverted to the question of fan fiction, and I was thinking about that in relationship partly to the larger question of contemporaneity that Ulysses manages to sustain and to kind of continually renew. And I think it's a fairly quick and demanding march that you make in the beginning of the lecture in generating the concept of what you call promptitude, right? Can you take a moment and unpack that just a little further? Because just for everyone else who wasn't there, or you haven't had a chance to fully go through it, this is the moment where in the early part of the lecture where Joe talks about the history of Ulysses' criticism in 3 parts, or 3 epics. And he works out this question of what he calls a structural latency. That's a tendency of Ulysses as a book of the world, a world-making book, that is remarkable for the way that it becomes what I mentioned before, like ever timely rather than timeless, ever constantly having a new relationship to the present rather than a kind of monumental text of a past that is receding in a way from its concerns. And I absolutely believe that. And as a teacher of Ulysses, that is absolutely true. It still has the ability to charge, and it doesn't come from its relationship to the history of the novel. It comes from its relationship to the history of everyday life in the present, right? And the full gamut, the entirety of human experience in that sense seems to me to be involved in what that concept is of the everyday in Ulysses. So if you could say a word about promptitude, Joe, is that?
Sure. Yeah. Well, look, I started with Richard Ellman's evergreen phrase, right? We are still learning to be Joyce's contemporaries.
Yeah.
And what he might mean by that. And I thought what he meant, and I still think what he meant by that, was that we're still learning how to read Ulysses. And when he wrote that, which was in, I think, 1959, so we're talking a long time ago, when he wrote that, I think that we were still learning how to read Ulysses in the kind of most traditional sense of reading Ulysses, trying to gather Ulysses' encyclopedic catalog of reference and allusion, and its formal design, and trying to understand. And I think that gave us the idea that Ulysses was somehow ahead of its time.
Yes.
Right. And that we were always catching up with it. right? I think that what happened was that, and I think that at a certain point, I think we caught up with it in that sense,
Yeah.
right? But what we didn't catch up with it, or it's not to be caught up with, it's a different dynamic, is what Derrida said about Ulysses, which that it is super potentiated as a text. And I was really interested in this idea of potentiated, right? And by potentiated, what I understand that to mean is, on the one hand, Ulysses is an encyclopedic representation of a certain historically grounded context, right?
Yes.
But precisely in its encyclopedic quality, right, it carries with it this, what I call this structural latency, right, that makes it also historically adaptive, right? And so everything that comes to us from that moment, that historical moment, right, everything that comes from that historical moment, right, can be accessed in the present, but not as a representation of the present, but rather as a series of advertences, right? A series of prompts. That's where I got to promptitude. That Ulysses, the structural latency of Ulysses is that in its text as world ambitions, it necessarily lays down prompts to do other things. And Joyce himself said to Frank Budgeon, he not only said, I'm happy that people find things in my text that I never put there.
Yeah.
He also said, and who's to say they're wrong, right?
Yeah.
And so which suggests to me that Joyce's idea is they're not wrong because this isn't a right or wrong issue, right? Can't be right or wrong about a prompt. A prompt is prompt, right? Right. It's right. It's not a subject of hermeneutical detection, right? It's a fit up, right? And so I think that this the web of representation lays down as its residuum a series or an endless series of possible prompts, right? Which so we're not learning to be Joyce's contemporary. Rather, we are repeatedly discovering that Joyce is our contemporary.
Yeah.
Right. That's what we are repeatedly discovering. Yeah. It's not that Joyce prophesied, it's Joyce enables us to discover prophecy in his work, which is a rather different business, right? And that promptitude, the fact that he is, and Ulysses is always able to be rediscovered as our contemporary, answers, and this is the one point in the lecture where I think I started to get at what I thought was a great thing that you said about anti-performance and the unconscious of the audience, answers to our promptings, right? And so the promptitude is a prompt of the text, but there's also the promptings, the inclinations, the propensities of the audience that converts, what in the text is a latency into an active incentive, an active provocation.
Yeah. So if we touch back on the question of performance and ritual, another place, well, Cersei obviously as the sort of, the psychic landscape that it charts and that it brings into being is a place for us to talk this issue through. But so too would be Ithaca, right? Because the structural form of Ithaca, it seems to me, in both the catechistical, but also in the sense of a new kind of, or an attention to new kinds of linguistic precision, of scientific, but also technical approaches to the English language that in the 20th century go from being a kind of small component of specialized textbooks and whatnot to becoming the massive production of manuals, user manuals of that massive body of where many more people make a living in the relation to language than do poetry scholars or novel scholars, right, in a way. And that too is structurally latent in Ithaca, right? And I wonder sometimes, Joe, about the choices one makes about where one goes to actually articulate that, and if Ithaca is another place where you would.
Well, Ithaca, I think, is a very interesting very interesting paradigm for structural latency.
Yeah.
And the reason I think it's an interesting paradigm for structural latency is because it crossbreeds catechism and scientific discourse.
Yeah.
Now, scientific discourse tends to be assertive, or at least declarative, right? And when you have a declarative discourse, you basically, the discourse marks its own limits, right? A catechistic discourse doesn't do that so well because it's involved in interrogatives, which can always be taken in multiple directions. So one of the things that, of course, is so much fun about Ithaca is you never saw that answer coming, right? Here's the question, and you never saw that answer coming. But I think that latency, that possibility that inheres in the catechistic question, right, is something that Joyce wanted to bring out, right? And it comes out because the tenor of the Inquisition is scientific, right? If it was religious, right, if it was like the Maynooth, right, then the tradition of pat answers to individual questions might overcome our sense of the latency in the questions themselves, okay? There is tremendous latency in the questions, by the way, in the questions themselves, right? Who made me? God made me, but we haven't defined what God is. Why did God make me? I have no clue, right? I mean, there's an answer, but the answer in the catechism is why God made anyone, not why God made me in particular, right? Right? You know what I'm saying? The latency is there. It's just that the tradition around catechistic indoctrination is such that you don't come up with it. The latency is there in scientific discourse, but the declarative nature of the rhetoric is such that you don't come up with it. But you crossbreed those two, right? And then the latency that any question, any serious question harbors as to possible answers can come out when you see these answers like, I never saw that coming.
Yeah.
Right. But it's an answer.
Yeah. But of course, so surprise in a catechism is a particular source of pleasure, right? I mean, there is a particular source of pleasure in a catechistical form that generates surprise, that generates
and I think that this is going to connect in a weird way to fan fiction, because I think that as we know, Joyce's foundational principle in Ulysses is the principle of incertitude, right? The void incertitude, world founded on the void incertitude. And incertitude is precisely what's at work in the latency of those questions, right? It gives you a scientific discourse not certain of itself. You're not even certain where it's going, right? But incertitude, I think incertitude is important to Joyce for this reason, right? Not just that it is the state of things. Freud said all men must bear with their portion of uncertainty, right? I don't think for Joyce it was necessarily a burden that you were bearing. It was the condition of creativity.
Yes.
Right. And we enjoy in Ulysses moments, particularly when the unpredictability, which is the stepchild of uncertainty, produces this sense of a kind of creative verve. But that's what fan fiction is about. That's why people like to do fan fiction, right? They like to find in the works they already love the possibility of extending, of exercising their own creative muscles. And we do that with Ulysses. I mean, we may not do it in the way that people, look, I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in fan fiction. I'm not. I had a student who that's what he did, but I didn't read the people that he was doing fan fiction on. So, but I think that you can't do, you can do fan fiction of Ulysses, but we do it in a critical mode, right? We take it and we remake the novel in whole or in part, right? And we experience the what we might call the jouissance of creativity in doing that, right? It's I think it's different than a lot of the literary criticism one does. I mean, a lot of the literary criticism one does is you analyze the structure, you find issues that are important to you, and then you determine the truth of the text. You're not determining the truth of Ulysses, right? You're not finding the keystone. You're building extensions, right?
Very interesting. So let me, I want to, if I can, get you to, or at least I'd like to think with you about how Joyce's attention to the way Dubliners speak, to conversation, and to the proliferative, swerving energy of chat, of Dublin talk, of Simon Dedalus, of the Citizen and of the people in Barney Kiernan's pub. There's a just in the sense of getting an answer to a catechistical question that you never expect. There are formal delights in Joyce's attention to the language of Dubliners that I think do something quite similar in being unpredictable, being playful, being creative, right? There's a creativity involved, even just in the rituals of banter and of conversation, that generates a kind of delight still.
I think that's true, although I guess I don't know.
I'm veering into territory that's a little, and I see why you're hesitant, but go ahead.
I'm hesitant for this reason only. I'm hesitant only because, actually, I'm only hesitant. I mean, my immediate hesitancy involves a novel I just read called The Cold Eye of Heaven. And all of the blurbs, and there were many, and it won a prize. And it's a good novel. It's a great novel. I mean, don't get me wrong. It's a really good novel. And it does something, I mean, or at least it's a really good idea for a novel. But all the blurbs were like, captures Dublin's patois perfectly. You can hear the Dubliners. And I guess I could, but I wasn't hearing Joyce's Dubliners. And these were Dubliners that were, mute and glorious Dubliners by comparison to Joyce's Dubliners. So I'm just wondering whether that's not just a function of Dublin, but also a function of the time, right? Right, early 20th century, we are still fully immersed in the world of the word. We are all, back then we were all people of the book in a way, and now we're kind of people of the image. And I don't know that there is a transhistorical dimension to Dublin. Language or discourse.
I actually believe there's a remarkable continuity between late 18th century Dublin ballad culture and what comes to us from the periodical literature of the time in terms of talk and chat and unpredictability, and Joyce's attention to that life in the late 20th century. And I do think in the early 21st century, so there is a radical difference in
well of course also, I mean, precisely because of Ireland's colonial circumstances and the kinds of political activities that and the kinds of political and cultural values that it sustained from the 18th century to the early 20th century, you still have a strong remnant of a proudly oral culture. And I don't think that I just don't think in the world of the
2020s,
that we have proudly oral cultures anymore, and that cannot but affect the vibrancy of speech.
I think I fully understand that. Are there any topics we've touched on that anyone would like us to sort of circle back to or pick up on a little further? We're going to run short on time in just a few minutes, and I could listen to Joe Valente talk all weekend. He's and obviously we've only scratched the surface of ways that we might go back into the text of the novel and touch on it. We do have one question that's been posted about the question of the prevalence of attention to sexuality and suppressed sexuality, which I think suppressed sexuality, I think, is not doesn't quite at all kind of capture the complexity of what Joyce is interested in. And the question of why do we talk most about sexuality, which is one of many elements of life seen in Ulysses. Sexuality is the force, of course, that is involved not only in social production but social reproduction, and so the law and the church and state understood its volatility. Sorry, Joe.
I was just going to say, I don't, I wouldn't have this lecture or, stand for what it, all that we talk about in Ulysses, or all that I talk about in Ulysses. Sure. I mean, you talked about the rituals that begin the novel, and I've written, a couple of pieces of some length on death and mourning in Ulysses, and the relation of ritual to that. So, I mean, I think that, and as I said in my lecture, I got interested in the actual contemporary topics that Ulysses spoke to. And before I wrote the Me Too, which obviously is going to be about sexuality at some level. Bye, Kate.
Hi, Kate.
I wrote an essay on Cyclops called "Reading Joyce in the Age of Trump," which was all about populism and racial politics and the contemporaneity of Joyce's intervention in Cyclops in viewing MAGA world under Trump. So I mean, I agree that I hardly think sexuality is the only thing we should talk about. It is, however, a pretty important thing in Joyce.
Well, but also, when you gave me the title of the lecture, I just thought, oh, that's interesting. Joe's, sort of linking it topically. Then as soon as I started to think about it, I was like, wait a second, the Me Too in Cersei is astonishing. Like this is just the sort of, when you look back and just think, that's the contemporary kind of absolutely jumping off the page in a way, and doing so in the context of a trial, right? And so, I have not followed. I did not know what it was about, the scandal of bye Michael.
Hi, Michael.
Take care, Michael. But the Johnny Depp Amber Heard, I never got her name right, which people are sort of issuing postmortems on Me Too at the sort of the very moment that this lecture was being delivered and being formulated, right? So the question of the contemporary just seems to me to be absolutely urgent in that the context, precisely the ways that you described, right? Sorry, the note from Claire here.
Bracken?
Yeah, my question is about Gertie McDowell in the context of Me Too and your thoughts on Nausicaa and Cersei. Since listening to your arc, I've been thinking of Gertie featuring in Cersei and how she says via Bloom's fantasy that she hates him for what he did, and I love you for doing that to me. If, as you say, that Cersei is the predetermined condition of the other episode of the novel, how do you read the sexual ethics of Nausicaa, sexual harassment, and Bloom's treatment of Gertie? Great question. Okay,
so there's a long history of treating the Nausicaa episode, and in the long article version of this lecture, I actually talk at some length about that history. And what I think you find is initially people treat Gertie as if she is sort of this hapless victim of advertising discourse and a kind of hapless, hyper feminine figure who is really victimized by Bloom. Something happened in the beginning of the 21st century in readings of that, which I think that Philip Sicker did a brilliant reading, which shows the extent to which Gertie is really in charge of the performance that occurs. That she orchestrates it, and Bloom actually kind of knows she orchestrates it. Bye, Greg. Knows that she orchestrates it, and it would be wrong to consider on this basis this is as a non-consensual event, or that Gertie is simply being victimized. Gertie and Bloom both have their investments, much as Martha Clifford, who shows up in Cersei, is not simply victimized by Bloom, but is part of the masochistic fantasy and participating apparently quite vigorously. Yeah. There was this further step, though, that I think is really important, which is a series of articles have been written about Gertie and disability, and the extent to which, as a disabled subject, or understood to be a disabled subject, Gertie would, in that culture, and indeed in most cultures until very recently, be regarded as outside the domain of sexuality, or denied their sexuality. And that Gertie's lure for Bloom is the very leg that is the mark of her disability, and her simulacrum of the tantum ergo in attracting Bloom is by moving that leg. Yeah. And so the leg of disability then becomes the mark of disability then becomes the instrument of sexual orchestration. At which point I think that we're now beyond what probably was always a kind of reductive view of Gertie, right? And a view which basically suggested that Gertie was not in control of her own sexuality, that she was this passive object victimized by Bloom, which is kind of an anti-feminist view of Gertie in the first place. That's what I would say.
All of that work has been really changed the way I approach teaching the episode, and it's a fantastic teaching episode, right? Because it generates its own series of readings and conversations that happen sort of in the way that it's structured formally guarantees in a way that. So there's another aspect of the performative and dramatic dimension of the text, I think, that's worth thinking about.
Part of the performative and dramatic dimension of the text is always that everybody wants to perform the sexuality that they want to perform and wants to disavow that that's what they're doing. That's what the society ladies do. How dare you? Here, let me show you something, right? And Bloom too, right? I mean, that there's this dialectic of attraction, performance, desire, disavowal, right? And that's at work in Gertie, and it's at work in the society ladies, and it's at work in Bloom.
Indeed.
And in fact, probably, I mean, I don't want to say this confidently. I think Molly may be the one character in the novel that exceeds this or transcends this dialectic.
You know what? That's a perfect place to end, Joe. That's a perfect place to end.
Okay.
It really is. We're right at time, 12:59. Joe, thank you, man. It's just so stimulating to talk about this novel with you. I'm so grateful to you for coming to NYU, for delivering the lecture, and for enjoying. I'm glad people seem to really enjoy the conversation.
Oh, great. I'm glad. I'm glad. And I would just ask, to send me the recording of it, because I just have these people that are been saying.
Yes, we will. Yes, we will. We'll get it up. Yeah. Terrific.
I just want them to, to
wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay.
Great.
Thanks everyone. Have a great day.